Shalom and welcome to Leaving the Promised Land, a discussion panel. I'm Professor Robert Kenedy of York University, one of the editors of the series and book, and I'm the moderator of today's panel. This is our second panel of the series, with the third one taking place on February 20th. This panel series is part of a book launch to celebrate the newly released Israel and the Diaspora, Jewish Connectivity in a Changing World, a volume that is part of Springer and Jews and Society series through the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry. We would like to thank the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies, the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, B'nai B'rith Canada, Springer, and the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry for their support of this panel series. We are living in precarious times with yesterday's synagogue hostage standoff, and with COVID, these are ongoing issues. Jewish connectivity brings us together, as does this panel on leaving the promised land. As noted, it is not only our second panel, but it's also the second section of the volume. Unfortunately, Professor Rahabun will not be joining us as he's sitting Shiva for his late father. We will miss his contribution. And of course, as editor of the volume, it's really unfortunate he can't be with us. However, we are fortunate to have today with us our two panelists for Leaving the Promised Land, one from the US and one from Canada. Our first panelist will be Professor Stephen Gold from Michigan State University, who will discuss the American segmented transnational identity formation in the Israeli diaspora. And of course, Professor Rina Cohen from York University, who will discuss the unleaving the promised land, the institutionalization of Israeli Canadians in Toronto. The structure of the panel today will consist of each panelist presenting for 15 minutes, followed by an exchange between the panelists and the moderator, leading to questions from the audience, eventually through the Q&A feature in Zoom. So now I will begin by welcoming both Professors Gold and Cohen, and looking forward first to Professor Gold's presentation in the series. Professor Gold.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and to be a part of the book and the series. This is a very exciting event. A little bit about my background. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology at Michigan State University. My interests include international migration, ethnic economies, ethnic community development, qualitative field methods, and visual sociology. And I'm the author, co-author or co-editor of 9 books. So my paper is entitled Adaptation and Identity Formation in the Israeli Diaspora. Diaspora Jews and Israeli immigrants share common religious and ethnic identity and maintain common ways of life as they pursue opportunities in the diaspora. At the same time, the two groups often emphasize contrasting nationalities. Diaspora Jews often identify with the host society in which they live, while Israeli immigrants embrace an Israeli identity even as they live abroad. In this paper, I draw on segmented assimilation and transnationalism, two contemporary theories of migrant identity, to explore how diaspora Jews and Israeli immigrants deal with commonalities and differences that they confront in diaspora locations. Jewish immigrants and their descendants from Eastern Europe have been a paradigmatic case of successful assimilators in many Western countries. They have adopted the nationality and culture and points of settlement, had little propensity to return to the country of origin, and overcame discrimination to attain levels of educational, economic, and social prominence matching that of the native-born elite. While identifying with the host society, at the same time, Jewish immigrants have also retained political, familial, residential, religious, and cultural characteristics that distinguish them from other middle-class members of the host society. This pattern is to a large extent a product of Jewish immigrants' de facto or de jure status as refugees, who had little connection to their country of origin and hence strong reasons to join the settlement country. While Israeli immigrants, who are now among the largest Jewish migrant populations in many Western societies, share social, cultural, occupational, and residential characteristics with native-born Jews, they reveal dissimilar patterns of adaptation. Most notable is their reluctance to identify with the host society. While they may remain in host societies for extended periods, achieve impressive records of social and economic mobility, raise their children in such settings, and acquire citizenship, they seldom describe themselves as host country nationals, socialize almost exclusively with other Israelis, frequently describe their intention to return home, and often do so. A major reason for Israeli immigrants' reluctance to identify with the country of settlement is that they have been socialized into Israeli culture and citizenship, a central tenet of which is that Jews, and especially Israelis, should live in and identify with Israel. Despite their generally strong identification with the Jewish state and their reluctance to become diaspora Jews, many Israelis nevertheless bear aspirations, outlooks, familial relations, cultural and economic skills, and social ties that link them to major Western cities. As they consider their identities in places of settlement, they cannot help but be aware that their emigration has been condemned in the eyes of at least some members of social groups, both Israelis and diaspora Jews, with whom they bear significant ties. Segmented and transnational identity formation. Instructive in itself, the case of Israelis' confrontation with dilemmas of membership offers an opportunity for evaluating contemporary theories about migrants' national and ethnic identities. Noticing the inadequacy of straight-line assimilation to explain the experience of contemporary migrants, two alternative bodies have come to the fore. The first involves segmented assimilation. The second body of work is associated with transnationalism. Segmented assimilation studies are primarily concerned with the children of recent immigrants to North America and other locations. Studies representing this approach generally describe how migrants create identities and deploy co-ethnic resources in ways that either facilitate advancement through such endeavors as educational achievement and the creation of ethnic economies, or preclude upward mobility via oppositional acculturation, rejecting school, and involvement in gangs and other marginal activities. This model applies to the historical experience of diaspora Jews in many cases. In contrast, research that emphasizes transnationalism often discounts the centrality of assimilation within a nation state and sees multiple, often deterritorialized forms of identity belonging in social solidarity in a global context as among the most significant basis of identity. Transnational migrants engage in frequent travel, and even those who do not themselves cross borders with regularity are described as residing within transnational social spaces. Many versions of transnational theorizing see the economic, political, and geographical mobility associated with border crossing as capable of granting immigrants a high degree of agency and flexibility to avoid forms of oppression associated with specific localities. These two approaches offer much to our understanding of the adaptation experience and identity formation of Israelis in Western societies. However, neither model is in itself presents a comprehensive interpretation of the complex feelings of connection, loyalty, and multiple opportunities and obligations that many contemporary migrants encounter. While the segmented assimilation model does a good job of showing how Israelis, like other Jewish migrants, join and adapt to host societies, it fails to capture the extent to which Israeli immigrants' identities and behaviors continue to be shaped by their country of origin, even as they reside abroad. And the transnational perspective, in my view, pays insufficient attention to the practical and existential difficulties Israeli immigrants confront as they seek to raise a family, earn a living, maintain a social life, all while negotiating between often conflicting sets of obligations, identities, relationships, networks, and opportunities associated with the country of origin on one hand and the country of settlement on the other. To better understand the patterns of adaptation and identification of Israeli immigrants, I draw upon segmented assimilation and transnational theories and review the impact of various national, religious, and ethnic forces on Israeli immigrants and host communities. And I lack the time to go into that in detail, but fortunately, there's the book published, which you can avail yourself of to read more detailed examination of the actual behaviors of Israeli immigrants. This analysis suggests that with time abroad, Israelis immigrants, and especially their children, increasingly downplay national identities and instead emphasize Jewish peoplehood as a means of reconciling their Israeli identity with their presence in the diaspora. In creating the identity of Israeli Americans, the IAC, the Israeli American Council, an organization that provides extensive programming in many locations for Israelis, the organization emphasizes shared identity of Israelis, Israeli Americans, and American Jews, and downplays issues of nationality and identity that may serve to divide the community. Conclusions. In this paper, I describe the actions of Israeli immigrants as partly compatible with elements of both segmented assimilation and transnational views of migrant identity, but fully consistent with neither view. Rather, their identities are simultaneously shaped by both the context of settlement, as predicted by the former, as well as their links to the country of origin, as suggested by the latter. The most accurate understanding of Israeli immigrants' outlooks is captured by a synthesis of the two approaches. It is important to remember that Israeli migrants' patterns of adaptation and identification are not simply a product of their own sentiments and ideologies. Instead, actions such as Israel's condemnation of or outreach to its immigrants, host communities' reactions to the Israelis in their midst, as well as political, social, and economic developments such as economic booms and busts, wars and political conflicts and points of origin and settlement, also have considerable impacts on migrants' outlooks and life chances. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gold. Now we're looking forward to hearing from Professor Cohen and seeing her wonderful PowerPoint presentation. Professor Cohen?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I'm very pleased that that Stephen talked about, or both kinds of conceptual frameworks. One is the segmented assimilation, and the other one is the transnationalism. My tendency is to more use the transnational theoretical concept. I'll share my screen, share screen. Oh my God, share screen. Can you see the screen? Share, sorry. Can you see the screen now?
I can, we just can't see the presentation.
No?
You have to click on the PowerPoint, I think.
Yeah,
Click on what?
PowerPoint.
The PowerPoint that you're going to be showing.
Ah,
Yeah, it's at the bottom, right there, yeah.
can you see it now?
Yes.
Can you see it? Okay. So I renamed my my presentation to "Unleaving the Promised Land," although people do leave the Promised Land, but they don't really do. And in some of, I think, Stephen's books, I read about a person in California that said that that Moshe can leave the Israel, but you can, or you can take Moshe out of Israel, but you cannot take Israel out of Moshe, or something like that, that one of his interviewees said. So my presentation will, how do I move to the next one? Oh my God. Okay. I shorten it to just a underscore the special situation. Canada many times is considered as part of North America, and a lot of the literature on Israeli immigrants is written by American scientists, and Canada is considered sort of part of North America. But I think that the Canadian context is unique and different. First of all, Canada has the policy, immigration policy is contextualized in terms of multiculturalism. Canada offers heritage classes to students in public schools. Kids can learn Hebrew, and it's all paid by the government, or even other languages. So that's one characteristic unique to Canada. The second characteristic is that Canada joined more international agreements regarding human rights of non-citizens. So even people who are undocumented, and many of the Israelis in the US and in Canada, many of the Israeli migrants are not documented, they get basic rights, the right to education for children, some even medical assistance. So in Canada, it's easier to, there is an easier access to these services. The third is Canada's social services. We all know that in Canada we have universal health care and housing programs that are superior to the I wouldn't say superior in terms of quality, but at least they cover everybody. So this is another unique characteristic of the Canadian context, which is different from the American and might be attractive to immigrants, including Israeli immigrants. Technological changes in Canada. In Canada, I'm talking about Toronto mainly. You know, there are daily flights, not now during COVID, but daily flights to Israel, direct flights with no stopovers. Israelis here are exposed to several, through our cable networks, to Israeli channels. Internet, of course, is common everywhere. So through the technological changes that, you know, I can have a complete different talk about that, but this these changes enhance the possibility of living a transnational life, even though you are stuck in minus 20 degrees and communicate with another country miles away and in a different weather. Another component which is unique, I think, to Canada is the Canadian Jewish community, which is relatively more Zionist, more religious than the American community, highly organized. Here we talk about the institutional completeness of the Canadian community. We had the Canadian Jewish Congress, which is not functional anymore, but other organizations. It's a high level of institutional activity, or a high level of an organization, institutional organization in the Jewish community in Canada relatively to the US. A lower level of intermarriage. There are many, many indicators that attest to the fact that the Canadian Jewish community is more cohesive. And then the last point is the government the Canadian government is supportive of the Jewish community and of Israel. Harper, everybody knows that Harper was more Zionist than many Israelis. And even Trudeau, I can bring lots of examples, although some people criticize him, but in general, we can say that the Canadian context is conducive to the development of a unique transnational community, which is in this case, the Israeli community. Another thing is the relationship to the larger Jewish community. Parallel to the relationships with the State of Israel, the Jewish community in Canada up to the mid-90s was a little, ignoring and displeased with the phenomenon of immigration from the land, from the Holy Land. This has changed, started changing in the mid-90s with the Oslo Accord, and changed more, and then in the year 2000 with the first Intifada. Anyways, in 2004, the Canadian Jewish community in Toronto initiated a major needs study and of the needs of the Israelis, and acknowledging that the Israeli Canadians differ in terms of language, biography, and levels of religiosity from the more older Jewish community in Canada. And from that year onwards, there is massive support of the Federation, of the Jewish Federation, supporting Israeli schools, supporting Israeli specific communities, communal and cultural services. And I have different examples. There is an Israeli school, Kahol Lavan. There is the Israeli Business Forum, the Israeli Canadian Community Project that supports cultural and social events. There is this organization, Hamifgash, that subsidizes Hebrew theater, dance groups, art exhibits, films, lectures, music, etc. My area of research was not really, one of my areas of research is Israelis. So, but I was more interested in issues of identity and transnational identities. I've done it on other groups, not just on Israelis. And I look at distinctive identity in terms, I think it's manifested through the social behaviors, through state of consciousness, and through cultural manifestations. So socially speaking, Israelis tend to develop friendships and affiliation with other Israeli Canadians and with Israeli Canadian organizations. There are numerous online networking of Canadians in Canada and of of Israelis in Canada and of Israelis with other Israelis throughout the world, and of course with Israelis in Israel. This intensified since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll probably talk about it later. In terms of state of consciousness, if you talk and interview Israelis, and I've done it in several studies, Israeli says we have dual identities, we are belonging here and there, and if you ask them, push them a little further, their dominant identity for most of them will be Israel rather than Canada. In terms of social production, I can also talk about that much more, but I wanted to bring you a couple of examples. One is the documentary Yesh Makom that was just documenting it starts with this thing, like the weather today down in Canada. Oh, sorry. So this is just one example, and you can see it, watch it to the end if you want, but it's very interesting to see. This is a group that produced an authentic Israeli musical or play every year, and it's all subsidized by the Jewish community. There is also an organization of Israeli artists, lots of them, sculptors and painters. I'm here. I want to end with a visual art example of an Israeli artist. Her name is Bila Morgan, and she's here describing an Israeli family in Canada. So she's painting olive trees that I planted on water. Water and olive trees don't go together if you know a little bit about olives. They always grow and thrive in dry and deserty weathers. But here she describes them here on a cold Canadian pond or lake. The olive trees are actually growing and thriving. So these are just a couple of examples on how deep this and how full and rich Israeli life, Israel-Canadian Israeli life is here in Toronto. So I think I'll stop here. I'm not sure if that's the right time, but it's 12:30, so it's time to shut up, and I'll elaborate more during question time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. If you could stop sharing, that would be great. Thank you for the visuals. I'd like to thank both Professor Cohen and Professor Gold for their presentations. Both very interesting in giving us a good North American view. So I'm going to give at this point, the panelists an opportunity to ask each other questions. Moderator, I will be asking a few questions, and also to remind the audience that if they want to type questions into the Q&A features we go along, that would be great. And I will be going through the questions in terms of asking them at approximately 3 o'clock. So Professors Cohen or Gold, any questions of each other?
I could just start out. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Dr. Cohen. That I started studying Israeli immigrants quite a time ago, and already she was one of the scholars that had investigated that area and provided a lot of motivation and insight and good perspectives and corroboration. So it's great to be collaborating. And I like very much your comparison of the U.S. and Canadian migration systems and settlement and the support of groups maintaining their own culture and so forth. That's a very important distinction. And there is a lot of literature about that, including other groups besides Israelis, but many of the same features are identifiable. One question that I wanted to ask, comparing some of my research to Rina's, is in my research, I noticed a lot of sub-communities. So people from different backgrounds or different segments of Israeli society formed different kinds of communities in the diaspora, so that in Los Angeles there were Yemeni Jews, and they attended a synagogue and had many more contacts with other Yemeni Israelis than they did with the broader American Jewish community or the Israeli community. And similar things, kibbutzniks, Persians, Latin Americans, also different levels, more working class people that run small businesses or involved in construction or glass work. And then there's the whole kind of very highly educated group of people in Silicon Valley and infotech, and also doctors and so forth. So I was wondering if you noticed some patterns where Israelis tended to, in some sense, reconstitute their pre-migration networks and tended to interact with people with social similarities to their own.
Yeah, it's a very good comment or question, because it's not, if you compare Israeli migrants, let's say, to Ukrainian migrants or others, it's a big difference. Israel itself is a country of migration and very segmented. Even in Israel, they talk about the 4 tribes. And here you have Haredim, and you have Yemenites, and you have different segments. Unlike the US, and I've read your work, it's fantastic work that you've done in Palo Alto there, or that I enjoyed very much. I also spent some time in Palo Alto myself. So, and it's true that you cannot talk about Israelis, you cannot homogenize this group. It's difficult and it's problematic. On the other hand, we have a tendencies, I think, Jewish sociologists or Israeli sociologists consider our case as unique. Yes, they come here, some people who come from Israel, from groups that were relatively marginalized in Israel, or weaker groups. When they come here, there is a resurgence of, or how should I say, there is an increase in loyalty to their particular group. But this is a universal phenomenon. So if people come from a shtetl, after a while you'll have the organization of people who came from Ukraine, from a particular place. So this happens, and there is sort of an increase in the pride of this group. If people come from India, in Canada, on the one hand, this division, or this between the castes there disappears. But on the other hand, you have people from the untouchables that create their own organization and feel very proud about it. So there are 2 things that happen. There is a diminishing of social boundaries that were so dominant in the country of origin. And there is an increase in the, I would say, in the ethnic pride or the segmented pride of particular groups. So you have in Toronto, like in the US, in Toronto, there is an Iraqi synagogue. There is a Yemenite synagogue. There is a Sephardic big synagogue at Bathurst and Steeles. So this is something that is worth continuing studying and seeing again the similarities and differences, but I think it's more similar. I think that many things that we think are so unique to us are common in other ethnic groups too. But there are segments in Toronto. Generally speaking, I think the Toronto community and the Canadian community is less segmented because Canada has about 10% or 14% of Jews, of Israelis in comparison to the US. So first of all, they are and they all concentrate in 3 major cities. The US is a larger country. The US attracted highly educated people, especially high-tech people, but also you have the highest rate of PhDs among Israeli Americans. On the other hand, the average education level of Israeli Canadians is higher than the one that in the US. So in the US, you have Israelis who work as movers and schleppers in New York. And then you have lots of academicians in different universities, lots of Israeli professors, and you have the high-tech people, and you have the people in the movie industry and people in the entertainment. So you have more niches. It's much more segregated in comparison to Canada. Canada was more attractive to middle-class Israelis with families. It's not so attractive to young single males, which are most of the migrants to America started like that, because it's a cold country. It's maybe less sexy than the US, but on the other hand, the social security here, the healthcare programs and an excellent school system. We have the best or one of the largest Hebrew school system in the world outside of Israel. So this is very attractive to families. So Canada is, in some ways, the Israelis in Canada are more like a homogenic group in comparison to the US. That's my impression, not backed up by lots of research, but I think it's worth researching this particular point of the segmentation of the community.
I think that I like that answer very much. Nancy Foner, in her book about migrants to New York, says that the U.S. tracks kind of migrants in an hourglass configuration. So very educated, but then also some people who are not very highly educated and are more likely to do physical work or informal economy or become entrepreneurs of different kinds. And so that reflects, and I think also the different cities certainly have that. You mentioned like the Silicon Valley. Well, California has 2 centers that there's quite a few Israelis in the Bay Area who work in Silicon Valley, tend to be more highly educated. And then there's a larger community in Los Angeles, which are more working class people, less education and more entrepreneurial and in construction and the media industries and other kinds of things like that. And then if you go to other locations that Boston and New York have had growing Israeli populations, tend to be highly educated, except the interesting exception of New York is that Haredi or Lubavitcher, highly religious Israelis also tend to move to New York, and they have a lower than average level of education. So New York has a, two different levels of recent arrivals. And of course, there's a lot of growth in immigration in Miami now that might have different class dimensions. I like also your comparison to other groups that are related to the segmented assimilation to some extent. There's the idea of pan-ethnicity. So for example, whatever you're from, if you come, your immigrant origins, you come to live in a diverse society like the US or Canada, people might be less affected by their country of origin cultures and over generations, and they kind of assimilate to a more common identity. So maybe Israelis and Jews over generations develop a more common identity in much the same way that youth from Korea, from China, from Vietnam, they develop Asian pan-ethnicity because they are culturally competent and citizens and so forth. And some of their communal and even physical features are how the larger society identifies them. So I think, especially describing the government support, the generous resettlement and welfare that are provided to Israelis in Canada might cause some development of the pan-ethnicity, which you're kind of describing.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask you, and it's very interesting because we always look at, try to predict the future. And in your observation, you ended your talk by saying that the second generation becomes more Jewish than Israeli, which is true. I can see that from my research too, that the second generation is less attached. This is universal to all ethnic groups in every immigration situation. The most extreme example is the Japanese in Canada. They are no transnational activity, nothing, fully assimilated, despite the fact that there are racial features that might identify them. So, but I think if we look at the future, as long as we have a stream of migration from Israel to North America and to other countries, as long as this stream continues, it keeps the Israeliness alive for a longer period of time, because this is a bloodstream that keeps coming and coming and coming and coming, and actually never stops. And it's true that it increases during conflict times or during recessions in Israel, but even now, despite the fact that Israel is a very strong economy now, there is a stream of migrants all the time coming. So, my prediction is that this community will continue to be lively and be transnational more than assimilated. And these are the two options you sort of presented as a result of this continuous stream of migrants. What do you think?
I think that's very accurate. Lilach Levery, she studied Israelis and other Jewish migrants settling in Western Europe and Belgium and France and so forth. And she finds that the Israeli component retains a strong, kind of an Israeli diaspora identity, where there's a lot of travel going back and forth. But at the same time, when things get harder for Israelis in the US or Canada or other locations, their return will increase relative to people coming over. Along those same lines, I mentioned the IAC. I encourage any of you to look at their website. They have an amazing amount of programming. They just had a big national conference for Israelis, and they call Israeli Americans. That's a new category that they're emphasizing. That they've had a national conference, and in a whole variety, must be 20 cities, they offer extensive training for families, for children, for teens, to maintain Israeli identity and culture, and also develop skills in terms of entrepreneurship and networking and so forth. So the influence of such an organization and other ones like it globally will certainly reinforce the maintenance of an Israeli identity.
And one more comment is that we don't live in a geographical world anymore. We are gradually moving to a virtual world.
Mm-hmm.
And so who knows, maybe 50 years from now, it doesn't matter where your body is.
Mm-hmm.
It's so this will also probably maintain or give more weight to our transnationalism rather than the assimilation, because it enables people, although they live in the US, it enables people to live in another virtual world, work in a virtual world, have pleasure. Some people are, there are fascinating things you can do through through this world. And this changes, I think, should change the way we look at migration.
Sure. I mean, now, with this coronavirus, we are interacting on computers with a person. They could be across the world, or they could be in the next room. And so that kind of puts everyone on the same level. The only thing is time zones. Those can be a little bit hard I had a student in the Middle East who had to stay up till 3 a.m. to attend one of my seminars last year because she was back in the Middle East.
Yeah, so this, I agree with you, but this will make a big change. We'll have to rewrite our papers on migration, because people can migrate in many ways without moving.
Now, yeah. I am watching the timelines, and I just wanted to, we've segued into this question that we discussed before we started, and that's the impact of COVID. We started addressing it, and are there specific aspects that COVID has had in terms of connectivity, ergo the theme of the book, but has connectivity shifted in the Israeli communities in Toronto or Canada, or in different parts of the US? So I just wanted to ask that question, and then we're going to go into the plethora of questions that are appearing in Q&A. Please.
Yes, so, Steve, you want?
Okay. Yeah, I think that it's been challenging that, the importance of visiting Israel, even with a Project Birthright and that kind of thing. The COVID has interrupted that and made that much more difficult. I think I've received, a few invitations to go to conferences and so forth in Israel, but those have been precluded. I also, even methodologically, I think both of us use qualitative field work. Well, you have to arrange a Zoom interview. You can't just go to a neighborhood and visit someone in their environment, which is very important for interaction, and also just for social scientists or entrepreneurs or whoever to engage and connect with various kinds of things. Earlier, the time zone. I've heard that I've done some considerable amount of research in California, and California has a very significant Israeli community. But one of the reasons of the attractions of New York and Boston is that it's closer in terms of travel and time zone.
Yeah.
So I think those are important factors. I think also, it's very interesting that people are looking to Israel. It has leadership in the vaccines and so forth, and that gives a different image and a different reliance. And also, Israel is in the position to shape policy not only for Israel and its diasporas, but for a whole variety of countries.
Yeah, I think that that the COVID created two situations. On the one hand, as Stephen said, makes it harder to meet people face to face. So in person, people don't meet. People migrating generally less. COVID is about sedentary behavior, whereas migration is about moving and so COVID and migration are conceptually conflicting. On the other hand, because we have this technology, we move in different ways. So I, for example, if at my age, I wake up in the middle of the night to do all kinds of things. And by the way, I'm checking my WhatsApp and I communicate with Israel for half a night. So in this, and in many ways, I'm closer to people, and even here in Canada, to people I write with or people, I'm closer to them than in the pre-COVID era. So it's a two-edged sword. That's how you say in English. So COVID made us, we keep social distance, but we are close in other ways.
I think those are very good points. I think in general, a lot of the findings about COVID is that it's has a social inequality effect, that people who work from home, who have stable households, who can pay the extra money to get their food delivered, they are impacted less. And also the way the stock market has been going despite COVID, they are profiting from that. Whereas people with fewer resources, they're less likely to have, legal migration status, so that they might be informal migrants. One of the paradoxes is there's this labor shortage, and less skilled immigrants would be ideal to take those kinds of jobs that are very essential, but not necessarily very desirable. And so that maybe the more affluent, highly educated elements of the community have a different impact than those with fewer resources and opportunities and legal status. Yeah.
That's an excellent point. In every area of sociology, we see that started studying the impact of COVID on different areas of social life. COVID contributes to a more extreme inequality in many ways. So it's in education, and it's in housing, and then it's in migration, and it's in and definitely in the economy, where the rich become super rich or much richer, whereas poor people are losing their jobs. And for migrants, it's harder to physically come. So that's how we don't have enough people to serve us in the restaurants or to clean our bathrooms or whatever.
And it also ties into the kind of general anti-immigrant mentality that's occurring in many parts of the world as well.
And an increase in racism, increase in anti-Semitism, so which is related to the topic of the book. So COVID has in general more a negative impact on this whole issue Yeah. But there are some advantages too. So maybe we see it because we tend to be middle or upper class.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take this moment now to thank both of you. And of course, we're not finished yet, but this was very stimulating in terms of having both your panel presentations and the exchange. Now, it seems that has had an impact on the audience. There are a lot of questions, comments. We won't be able to get through them all because, as I think I hinted, there's a plethora of them. Which is wonderful. And it's always great to see an engaged audience. So I think we're going to start with Professor Della Pergola's question, very interesting question, because some of them have been partially answered and maybe not others, but this one hasn't really been addressed. So I'm choosing them based on, what has been addressed and really what hasn't. And he asks about the patterns of political voting of Israelis in both Canada and the United States. Any main patterns and changes over time he's asking about. So Rina's smiling, I can see that. So go ahead, Rina.
Again, you cannot talk about Israelis as a homogeneous group. There is a tendency in Israel in the last, I would say, 30, 40 years, I think, to vote more right-wing, and the same for Jews in the diaspora. But I know that the American Jews are, I'm talking about the Israelis. The Israelis tend to be more right-wing, and they become more nationalists and right-wing in the country they migrate to. Again, a universal, I think, tendency. Migrants become more nationalistic and patriotic in some ways, politically more nationalistic than they were in the country of origin. So I don't know exactly, I don't know the exact voting patterns, but I know in Canada, the tendency is to vote for the Conservative Party. Israelis vote more for the Conservative Party. This reflects maybe the characteristics of this group, which is more families, middle-class families in Canada. In the US, I think working class will vote more to the Republican. Younger and more educated migrants will probably vote more Democrats. And the Jewish community in general, the American Jewish community tends to vote historically more to the Democrat, or support the Democratic Party more than the Republican Party. But it's an interesting question. I know in relations to the politics in Israel, I know that some immigrants, some Israeli Canadians are flying to Israel before elections, and they were in Israel in the last couple of years 4 times, because we had so many elections in Israel, to support in most cases, and I think it's, I don't have hard numbers, but I think to support right-wing parties in Israel.
Yeah, there's a very interesting comments and a very interesting question. I think I've looked up, I don't have my finger on it now, but recently the Israelis in general are, in the US, are more on the liberal side, like the larger Jewish community, maybe not to that extent, but I think I've done comparisons of Soviet Jews and Israelis as 2 of the major Jewish migrant groups, and that the Soviet Jews are much more conservative than Israelis, and more likely to vote Republican, whereas Israelis are as a group as Democrats. But one of the recent social phenomena is that there's just like this polarization in a lot of countries, and especially in the US politically, that's also represented in the Jewish community. And there's about people will argue about the estimates, but perhaps 30% of the Jewish community is quite conservative and supports, a Republican agenda, and then a larger fraction of the Jewish community, and a majority is retaining commitment to the Democratic Party, but different levels of resources, different local issues, different leaders can affect that. But I think that that as far as I've looked at it over time, Israelis have retained a more liberal perspective in the U.S. and more or less connect to the Democratic Party. And I think that is that Israel, even though there are working class Israelis, that a lot of the demographic data show that they're one of the highest educated groups, so that would be compatible with their support of a liberal party, just like the Jewish community, which is also in the U.S. Highly educated and leaning Democrat. But there is stratification across different localities, issues, and political formulation.
Talking about different localities, I think that some of the strongest Trump supporters are among the Jewish community in Miami, including the Israeli community. So, so it's very hard to talk in general terms, because there are pockets where Israelis and Jews believe that the Democrats are a disaster for Israel, and Trump should, and they were involved in some of the most extreme efforts to retain or to and now involved in the efforts to bring Trump back to power.
Yeah. That of course Miami is the location of the settlement of all different kinds of Latin American groups, but including the Cubans. And when the 60 wave of Cubans came, they were very influential and very successful in business and other activities. And there was a significant Jewish component there that built that system. And there's other Latin American migrants who are Jews that might have a particular political orientation and is reflected in different areas.
Wonderful, wonderful. And it's exciting to see some of the audience members are asking very similar questions, picking up on what were mentioned in terms of second, and there's a question about even third generation Israeli Canadian, Israeli Americans in terms of, that migration and retaining identity. But what about them? What shifted from their parents to the second and third generation, hopefully? So I'm going to open it to both of you in terms of Canada and the US.
I would say, I don't have detailed systematic data about that, but I've heard a lot of anecdotal information, and I think in many cases, they tend to be influenced by their parents. So they might follow some patterns within, a more conservative parent will mobilize the young people in their family to maintain a strong Israeli identity. There's what the Lone Soldier program, where Jewish youth from the diaspora can serve in the Israeli Defense Forces. That's pretty popular, even though it's not specifically designed for Israelis. Many Israeli youth, living in the U.S., I've heard are engaging it. There's some statistics that it's a fairly significant number, so that would reflect a strong orientation. On the other hand, because in some ways, Israelis are so close to the established Jewish community, the native-born Jewish community, in terms of education and language and occupation and residential patterns, that there are people who second or third generation who seem indistinguishable from other native-born Jews who have an Israeli background. It's a very permeable and easily accessible transition to make. That rather than I'm Israeli, I'm part Israeli in much the same way that other Jewish groups might trace their ancestry to Eastern Europe or Russia or other locations. So,
yeah, I agree.
So I think there's probably both trends.
I agree. I think second, third generation are sort of distancing themselves, not always intentionally, from this strong with identifying as Israeli Canadians, and they cling more, if they stay within the Jewish milieu, they cling more to identify themselves religiously as Jews rather than Israeli Canadians. So they say they are Jewish Canadians. And
I think Professor Cohen has frozen. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of communication in COVID is we depend on it. So what I might do, hopefully she'll be returning, and is move on to a related question that was asked in terms of belonging. We touched on that. Both of you have in your chapters, but belonging not only in this case in the US and Canada, and I'll repeat this for Professor Cohen, but also, maybe not necessarily belonging back in terms of transnationals in Israel again. So what maybe did you find in your data in terms of belonging, and then maybe the notion of return, or maybe elsewhere? I mean, when I've done research on belonging and transnational movement and so on, they may say, okay, I may have to consider other places. So is that also an issue, within your sample?
I would say yes. I've noticed. I mean, there's it's going back quite a ways, that having to do with the age of the children. And one Israeli immigrant meets another and says, "When are you going to go back?" "As soon as my son is finished with high school." "How old is he?" "He's 3." So this idea of being oriented towards the child's socialization, because when it gets to the age of military service and attending higher education, that's a important distinction. And that if a family decides that their kids are going to remain in the U.S. or Canada or another location, that to a fair degree kind of locks them out of the opportunities and networks and expectations of Israel, so that many parents are reluctant to do that. And I've interviewed some in various communities, Silicon Valley and others, but it becomes an important point when the child is ready to be completed with high school, and then is going to go into the next period of their life. That's going to really determine their commitment to, if they go back to Israel, they could always return to the US for military service and education and other kinds of things. But if they don't have those experiences, their access to Israeli society will be somewhat limited.
Thank you.
So that's often discussed. I've even heard some anecdotes about that, a brilliant young student will wind up going to community college in the US with their parents' approval, to kind of extend that period on, rather than, going to a strong university that they've been admitted in the US, but having matriculated there would cut off other possibilities in terms of going back to Israel.
Wonderful. And just for those who may be chiming in a bit later, we have temporarily lost Professor Cohen's connection. hopefully will be returning. So still a pleasure to deal with Professor Gold. And, we can circle back at various points with these questions. But intermarriage has come up, and this is a theme within the volume in various chapters, and this notion of retaining Jewishness through the generations. What of the Israeli immigrants or transnationals, as we may want to call them, compared to other U.S. groups in terms of intermarriage, in this case religiously, but otherwise, are there trends that you found within your data or anything that was mentioned?
I think that a lot of the data shows that there's pretty low rates of intermarriage among Israeli immigrants. It was interesting to see an earlier generation of people who started coming the first waves in the 60s or 70s. I think there was a higher rate of intermarriage amongst them, maybe because there weren't many other Israelis that they could marry. They oftentimes would marry and then have a conversion. But that's one of the issues that in the U.S. There's a variety of the different groups of Judaism accept to some extent conversion and intermarriage, whereas in Israel that's much more restricted. So that might have an impact. But I think there is quite a low rate, I think.
And I just checked my phone. Professor Cohen did text me that she is having problems with her Wi-Fi, which is not unusual. Sometimes on these cold days in Toronto, we never really know. So I'm going to move on to other questions, and we will go back and forth. And what was also asked is really looking at these various generations. What about in terms of the diasporic identity? Has there been shifts? Because we're drilling down a little more in terms of what is typically sociological. Has there been a shift in terms of this diasporic identity over into the second and third generation, even the first? Have you found that in your data?
Well, I think that's one of the interesting findings. Rina mentioned the term Yorjim, which was kind of a stigmatized label that was put upon Israeli immigrants, especially prior to the late 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that and that was both came from Israel, looking at people that left, and some of the famous statements about the weaklings and other kinds of that Israeli officials had made about immigrants. But the movement away, that the term Yorjim isn't used as much, and that various policies that Israel has had and famous statements where they've backpedaled that idea that Israel still cares about Israelis, especially.
Professor Cohen, otherwise I never would answer. Hi, Rina. Okay, so then you know what we're going to do? I'm going to put you on speaker. We had to sort of do something odd like that, and then we can circle back. Hopefully, this is going to be an odd, low-tech, high-tech kind of move on our part. So I'm going to put you over onto speaker. Sorry to the audience and others.
Okay, that's
sorry, Stephen. Sorry, Rob.
Welcome back. If I can just finish this, so that earlier on, there was a very stigmatized or negative view of Israeli immigrants in the diaspora, both from Israel and also from local Jews who kind of followed the Israeli government lead and didn't feel it was appropriate to outreach to them because that would kind of encourage a inappropriate activity. Well, that's been pedaled back quite a bit now, where there's both the Israeli consulates and other government agencies and the American or the host Jewish community now outreaches and incorporates and celebrates Israelis. And in many cases, Israelis are functioning as Hebrew teachers for various organizations. And with the most recent level that I mentioned with the IAC, the Israeli American Council, they created this new terminology that was kind of a non sequitur, maybe in the 70s or 80s, which is Israeli Americans. And Israeli Americans are a part of the Jewish community, and that they have a leading role. They can be completely involved and connected with Israel, but very comfortable in the US and are provided with assistance and celebration and programming to maintain that identity. So I think that the idea of retaining positive relations and that Israelis who have to go where they, as Rina said, even if the economy is strong, there's still people that travel abroad. They feel connected to Israel, even if they're in the diaspora, and the stigmatization has been greatly reduced.
Thank you. So just for your sake, Rina, I asked about and drilled a little deeper in terms of second and third generation and the diasporic identity. And what did come up in not only your chapter, Rina, but to some extent Stephen's, but Uzi's specifically is, and it's already come up regarding Israelis. In other words, how it was viewed in the 90s, as you mentioned, to leave Israel, but how has it shifted in, amongst, the second and third generation, and how they view their own diasporic identity?
Yeah. So I agree with Stephen. But again, it's in some ways it's a universal phenomenon where countries of origin, and especially in Israel, the immigrants, the people who left, were considered a liability, and from a liability they became an asset. Now countries are reaching out to their expatriates in other countries, and they can use them. They are an asset, an economic asset, a political asset. Many Israelis serve in different functions connecting between Canada and Israel. So the Israeli government, for several reasons, was condemning the people who leave. Whereas now, it's not that they are praising them, but they are proud of them. And in Israel, you'll see in the Israeli TV lots of shows telling the success story of Israelis in the US or in Europe, or and they are an asset. The world, we have to think about it in terms of the process of globalization. The more globalized we become, these connections are very, very important for Israel. And so they invest financially, they invest in many other ways in communities, and the Israelis themselves are trying to organize. Another thing is, because this diaspora is aging, so to speak, they want to maintain connections to Israel. When the first migrants came, they have the connection, but second and third generation are encouraged to join let's say an Israeli youth movement, to join the Tzofim or the Scouts, the Israeli Scouts, or to join, or to go back and serve in the army, or to come to Israel on different programs. So and they became an asset. There are many ways. I don't know. Nobody calculated the importance or the contribution of these people to the Israeli economy. There are a lot of connections now. It's enough to watch the Israeli movies on Netflix that were also sort of marketed by Israeli expatriates in the US.
Yeah, I think those are very good points. I think there is some data about philanthropy, and if Israelis in the diaspora become financially successful, they're much more likely to contribute to Israeli-based causes or institutions rather than the Jewish funding in the host society.
Yeah, that's true.
And just,
I agree.
I'm just going to circle back again when you lost your internet connection. I asked a question about rates of intermarriage amongst second and third generation, Israelis that have, basically we're seeing them as transnational in other ways. But Professor Gold already addressed this, but I'll ask you, Professor Cohen.
I don't have the exact numbers or the exact rate of intermarriage among Israelis, but and this will be anecdotal, but this is again from general literature on intermarriage in general of ethnic groups. As the community becomes more senior and more years, the American Jewish community in general has a higher rate of intermarriage in comparison to the Canadian, not because they are, naturally different, but because it's an older community. They migrated and started 100 years before people came to Canada. So the Israeli community is a relatively young community. So the rate of intermarriage is lower. Another issue is, what do you call intermarriage? When I was growing up, if an Ashkenazi Jew was marrying a Yemenite boy, this was intermarriage. Here, I don't know the exact rate of how many Israelis marry other Israeli Canadians, but most of them are marrying still within the Jewish community. Many marry out, marry Christians, marry Muslims, but I don't have the exact numbers. But I'm sure that this trend will continue, and the longer we stay in Canada, the higher the rate will be, and it's natural.
And I'm going to go to another question, and some of it has been answered, but going back to transnationalism, which I think came up in both your chapters, if I remember correctly, and we've touched upon some of it, but how transnational would you say your samples were? Not only going back and forth, as we already mentioned, but this notion of this hard rate of return. In other words, I definitely will go back, or I definitely will not go back. Or as I mentioned, when you got cut off, Rina, maybe is there another destination they may be thinking about? Or are there, if it's Toronto, or if it's someplace in Canada or the United States? So, it's
an excellent question, because many people migrate in steps. It's called in the literature step migration. Mm-hmm. So it's easier to get into Canada in many ways, and getting and the process of getting full citizenship is shorter. So Canada, of course, is, if you see the requirements of immigrants, many Canadians wouldn't be eligible to even apply to landed immigrant status, but it's relatively easier to get to Canada. So many people will come to Canada, and from Canada will migrate to the United States. And sometimes it's many people who come with no papers come first and land in New York, and then they'll resettle in other parts of the US, or Los Angeles. So I don't know exactly if this is what you are referring to, but
actually more in the long run. In other words, let's say they've spent X amount of years in Canada or in the US, then they say, okay, I want to go back and I will be going back. It's definite, or, maybe, or is there another destination that they may say, you know what, I've had enough of Canadian winters, especially today when it's minus 22, and I want to go down to Los Angeles or Miami, where there's a strong Israeli/Jewish community.
Yeah, there is in the long run, there is people migrate to other places. In Canada, they tend to land in either Montreal or Toronto, and they remigrate to Vancouver, which is also a form of migration. It's internal migration, but it's a better weather, a different kind of population there, a different, kind of, they have their own characteristics, the Israelis who live in Vancouver. So, as to going back, we know from general literature on migration, that people, when they come, not just from Israel, it's definitely many people will say they want to go back. Whereas people who left Ukraine don't plan on going back to the Ukraine, most of them. But if migrants, and some people come for a few years and go back, but generally, if they don't return within 3 to 5 years, they will not return. They live with the myth of migration. I wrote an article called The Myth of Migration, the myth of return. They live with it. It's something that keeps their transnationalism alive. So they continue, investing in Hebrew schools and trips back home, but they don't return. It's a myth that keeps them alive here as a transnational community. Although some return, I'm not saying nobody returns. In Israel, I'm still thinking that this whole notion of migrating, especially from Israel, is we should redefine it, because in Israel they start talking about relocation. They don't call it migration. Relocation, that is supposed to be temporary, but but it's temporary, for 20, 30 years, 40 years, it's temporary. So, in terms of step migration, they'll come first to Canada. It's easier to come to Canada. In Europe, they'll come first to Berlin. For several reasons, it's easy for the Israelis to migrate to Germany and then move to other countries. So it all depends on the migration policies of these countries, how they keep their gates, either very closed or very selective or wide open. So I don't think there is a general trend. I know of many people when going to America, sometimes they compromise. They come to Canada and then move on to the US. This is more common among Russian Israelis, which is another group we didn't talk about. But we talked about the fact that Israeli Canadians are not a homogeneous group. Within them, you have the Russians, which are, partly Israelis.
Yeah. And before Professor Gold, I'd like to answer that question, but both of you do touch on, if I remember correctly in your chapters, Russian Israelis, especially I think Professor Gold did too. So maybe that could be a follow-up after you answer this, because it is an interesting part of the Israeli diaspora in terms of, and this is almost the odd example of it in terms of, Soviet Union, Israel, then Canada, US, and maybe elsewhere. But let's just I just want to stick to this question and get to that one later.
Okay. Well, so should I make comments about the transnationalism, or you want to move?
Please, if just to general, so we can keep it.
Okay, well, I think a lot of literature about migration generally says that people, we have this myth about, maybe our grandparents pulled up roots and came and settled. I think a lot of migration now, people say migration is a process, not an event, and someone might, come to the US or Canada just thinking they're going to, get a master's degree or just visit for a while, and one thing leads to another, and they might wind up staying a long time. And our view of that is partly shaped that both the US and Canada are countries that are populated by migration. But there is the idea of transnationalism is you don't focus so much on your national identity. There are quite a few Israelis that travel for relatively short periods of time related to work or other kinds of things. So they might live in Paris for a while, then back to Israel, and then Canada, Australia, those kinds of things, back and forth. And so it's an ongoing process. It's also interesting that this is one of the things that happened early on. I did some research and looked at research about kibbutzniks and their emigration. Well, back then, Israel wasn't as affluent, and so maybe the kibbutz would pay for someone to have one or two trips in their entire life, whereas now people will take several international trips a year, so that the cost and logistics has transformed. There was a famous movement, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, but following the military service, young people they called them Israeli backpackers, and they would go all around the world. They loved to go to places like Thailand, and they might stop in the US on the way, but they more exotic South America, Asia locations that were fun to visit and blow off some steam between the military service and being more serious. So I think there is quite a bit of travel back and forth, somewhat spontaneous, less planned, but that's something that more and more Israelis are doing because they have the opportunity and the finance to do it. It's interesting with our Jewish Studies organization, Judith, she's the president of it, and she's a professor at the University of Mexico. And that there's growing, there's a few articles, there's a young woman scholar in Israel who's also studied Israelis in Mexico. So there's, new trends and opportunities, and whether they're, planning to settle there for a long time and raise a family or just spend a while, that kind of works out on its own. But that would be part of transnationalism. So people would go for shorter periods.
Mm.
Yeah. And now what about the interesting diaspora of Israelis that many of them are Russian speakers, and maybe both of you commenting on that specific, is that you both I covered it to different extents, but what about that? Let's call it a subpopulation, and very interesting one and prominent one, definitely in Toronto. I can't speak about the rest of it, just anecdotally. So I'll let you both comment, please. Rina?
Okay. Just a little comment to the previous topic. Israelis travel more than young Israelis travel more than any other young people from other countries in the world. And one of the reasons is, young people in Canada, young people will move, I don't know if they are in Halifax, they move to Toronto, or Israel, migration is usually done, most migration is internal, and if not, it's to the adjacent country. Israel is surrounded in a way, it's a small country, you cannot travel much. You travel for 4 hours, north to south, you finished it. So it's true that Israelis now, it became like a rite of passage to go for extended periods of time, at least a year or 2 years, to Far East, to go to India, to travel in South America, and some of them get stuck there. It wasn't maybe the initial intention to stay in Mexico City, but they meet people, they work a little bit, maybe study, and they settle for longer years there. Okay, as to the Russians, Russians are again, there was a huge exodus from the ex-Soviet Union in the early 90s, when, and most of them came actually not to Israel, but to the US, but I'm not sure, actually, I'm not sure. But about 1 million of these people came in the 90s to Israel. And many of them came to Israel because this wasn't their first choice. Most of them are not Zionists. This was a way to get out of Russia or the other countries of the bloc, and some migrated to the U.S., managed to migrate to the U.S. from the different camps. Many of them came through Italy, stayed in Italy for a year, and then moved on. So from the same camp, some people who didn't get a visa to go to the US or to Canada, coming to Israel, the moment you land there, you are a citizen. Some had some issues, but most of them became citizens. They had relatives who moved to New York or to Toronto. So over the years, in the major cities of the US and some in Europe and in Canada, in Montreal and Toronto, these initial migrants started a chain migration of Russian Jews that come from Israel to join them here. And so little by little, we developed here in Toronto quite a substantial Russian community. But again, it's not homogeneous. Some of them are spent 10 years already in Israel. So for the younger generation, they speak Hebrew. So how do we calculate them, or how do we relate to them? Do we call them Israeli Canadians, or do we call them Russian Canadians? Most of this group settled in Jewish neighborhoods. In Toronto, there is, for example, a Ukrainian neighborhood on Bloor and Christie there. But most of the Jewish Ukrainians came and settled in Thornhill, along the Bathurst Strip. So in many ways, they behave like Israeli Canadians, where they settled in Jewish areas. They got a lot of assistance from JIAS and from the Canadian Jewish community. And especially the young ones are sort of hopping in between these two transnational communities, between Israelis and Russians. So because there is a Russian community or a Eastern European community, an old one that settled in Canada in the 30s, especially in Western Canada and in Central Canada around Winnipeg and in Alberta too. So some of the Jews settled in Christian Russian communities, like in terms of, but most of them, the ones who come from Israel, are after, especially if they stay in Israel for a longer period of time, tend to settle in the Jewish communities. And it's different than, I think it's more polarized or more segmented than the Israeli community in terms of education. So you have a small minority, highly educated, but a lot of older people and single parent families that need more assistance than the Israeli the veterans. Like their level of English is not as good as the other Israelis.
The demographics is very important, as you point out.
In Russia, English was not the second language. Most of them were exposed to a little bit of French or German, but not to English. So language proficiency is very important. So I don't know. It's a unique group within the Israelis, but again, all these subgroups don't have definite boundaries, so it's hard to count them. And how, some people were born in Russia, moved from Russia to Italy, were in Italy a couple of years, moved to Israel, then came to Canada, and many of them migrated from Canada to the US, because most of the Russian Jews, I think, now live in the United States.
So again, I'm going to shift over to you, Professor Gold, and any of your data where, there were Israelis of the former Soviet Union that you interviewed. Go ahead, please.
Sure. I did know people that were, there was actually a community activist and kind of performer who was originally from Soviet Union, moved to Israel and became part of the Israeli community, had a family with a Israeli man. So that's fairly common. I think there were quite a few more Russians that went to Israel up until about 1989. They received, in contrast to Israelis who don't get refugee status, the Soviets did as part of the Cold War. So they were given benefits. But there was those benefits were taken away, and it became harder to move to the U.S. Around the late 80s. And so the largest number went to Israel, and they played somewhat of a role of Israel getting more into infotech because there were many engineers. Demographically, the Soviet Jewish population is unique. They're very old. The average age is quite high, and because of the Second World War and other kinds of things, it's very heavily female dominant, and they have quite a small family size, so that there might be one or at the most two children, prior to migration. And they live in multi-generational households, so that there might be 3 or 4 generations together. So in the sense, they were concerned and had the needs of elderly family members, which restricted their mobility a little bit, whereas the Israelis tend to be young, and that's the conditions that are opening up new opportunities. But I think the Soviet Jews resettled in Israel didn't have that great of a rate of migration to the West. I haven't seen data on that specific population, unfortunately.
Now, ideally, unfortunately, as noted, Professor Rahabun was not able to join us because of, sitting Shiva for his father, but it would have been interesting if we had the opportunity to round out the panel, because somebody did ask about the differences between European, as compared to North American migration, in other words, of Israelis. And of course, the interesting part of his article, or chapter, I won't say too much about it because it was excellent. He's not here to present it, was, the elephant in the room of going back to Germany, considering, the Shoah and everything, and how that was viewed too. So I'm not sure if either one of you can address the differences this person asked about, in terms of other parts of the world. So not only Europe, but Latin America, Central America, because Professor Gold, you mentioned that, but also, parts of, Australia, because there's all these opportunities, and Australia offers some of the weather benefits that Canada doesn't in terms of comparing it more to Israel and the dryness and so on. But I don't know if either one of you can comment on that. So I'm just going to open that up.
Well, those are very good questions. I mean, just for a sidebar about Australia, South African Jews love to move to Australia. You know, the weather, the English cultural influence, so a very large fraction have moved there. It's a complex issue because actually the number of American Jews that have made long-term aliyah isn't that great. So that could affect the return process. I think currently, I think that there's concern about moving to Europe in general, not only because of the historical legacy, but because of the current rise of certain political and religious movements that have made Israelis feel insecure. And so there might be opportunities, but also they're seen as risks. And so they might plan to, that might emphasize the transnationalism, that I can live in Belgium or France for a period of time, but I'm not going to set too deep roots, and I'll visit Israel a lot and ultimately plan on returning. So it might be, the present logistical aspects that are significant.
Thank you. Professor Cohen?
Yeah, I have something to add to it. The migration of Israelis to Germany, especially to Berlin, started. For a while, Israelis didn't go to Germany, but it started when there was an economic crisis in Israel, and there were lots of demonstrations against the high prices, and they called it the cottage revolution, where people, there were demonstrations of the high cost of living in Israel, high cost of real estate and food. And Germany is a convenient destination. First of all, many Israelis acquired a European Union passport, and Germany was very generous towards Jews. By the way, lots of Russians. Older Russians migrated straight from the Soviet Union to Germany, because for them and for ethnic Germans who lived in the ex-Soviet Union, there were special programs in Germany. So Germany, and they have a very developed social welfare system. So Germany, in many ways, was very attractive to Israelis. The migration to Germany from Israel is mainly younger people. They can study for free in good European universities if they have a European Union passport. And now in the world today, you can have 2 or 3 passports. And so for Israelis to go, some even go to Spain and Portugal. And this was an incentive, and they started. So you have entrepreneurs started businesses like restaurants, and also went to school there, especially in Berlin, but in other centers too. So I think this is what is attractive for Israelis in Germany, and it's close to Israel, closer than North America. So yeah, unfortunately, or I don't know, depending on how you look at it, but with the history of Germany, now Germany in Europe hosts the fastest growing Jewish community, which is interesting. I don't know, I haven't studied it, but it's interesting.
There's a huge Russian community there too.
And they started organizations and schools, Jewish schools and Hebrew schools, not just in Germany. There are some in Hungary, and and of course in Western Europe. So yeah, and also there is a Russian community, a growing Russian community, but as Professor Gold said, they are older migrants with different motivations.
And Professor Rehoboam's chapter touches on all of that, and it's a nice section in terms of the three of your chapters, and they come together and intersect in various ways in terms of connectivity, but definitely worth the read. And as noted, the book will be coming out very soon. So I will use this now as a segue, and of course, it's always the specter of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which will be covered in the final panel, and it's one of the final chapters of the book in terms of looking at anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and we will be having the well-known academics coming through, thankfully, Carrie Nelson from the United States, and Jonathan Boyd from the UK. I will be the Canadian representative in terms of that panel, and we're looking forward to that. This is on February 20th, and it will be announced. The poster will be coming out very soon. So this is great, and I am now going to thank the panelists, and we are thinking almost virtually sitting Shiva with Professor Rehoboam, and we are very sorry that he couldn't be part of this, but he's here, in terms of his chapter, but wonderful nonetheless. So I will be thanking our panelists and our audience members for some very interesting questions. And I'm glad we worked everything out in terms of the fun of technology, internet being what it is. I'm also going to thank not only, of course, the other contributors to the volume, and some of them did ask direct questions, but more specific, I'd like to take some time thanking again the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies for all their support for not only the original conference, the volume, and of course doing this panel, and especially Julie Feinberg for her invaluable assistance in terms of putting up with us, fussy academics regarding all the changes in the poster and everything. She's been wonderful, and braving, Sundays, for these. So we really do appreciate it. Also, I want to thank the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies for funding the panel series. And we're thrilled about that. And I should also mention that our York University president, Rhonda Lenton, is a co-author of one of the chapters in the volume. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't thank Michael Mostyn and his staff for B'nai B'rith for supporting the conference, the volume, and our panel series. We're always grateful for our community members. And then finally, Springer. It's been a long process putting the book together. We've had wonderful chapters and colleagues. It was nice meeting people in person. These in-person conferences seem like a relic of the past. Hopefully not. But thankfully, we do have our panels and we get to see each other virtually. And that's always wonderful. But more specifically, our colleague, Professor Judith Boxer-Liverant, who not only is a contributor in terms of authoring one of the chapters about Latin American and Central American Jewry, but also the president of the Association for the Scientific Study of Jewry for her support of the panel series, and of course, advertising it amongst members of that association, and to not lightly mention that this book is part of that collaboration between Springer and the association. So we're very grateful for her and all her support and contributions. So we are again hoping that you will join us for our final panel. considering all the things that are happening in the United States, the unfortunate situation yesterday in Texas. We don't know motives and so on, but we do know that it did happen in a synagogue, and we're grateful that there wasn't a tragedy as a result of it all. So again, thank you all, and audience members, thanks for your patience. Rina, your ingenuity in terms of calling and using that low-tech, high-tech kind of point of the phone, and Stephen, for you being patient in terms of going back and forth when we lost Rina. So thank you to all, and we're looking forward to the February 20th panel, our final panel, number 3, in terms of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Have a wonderful day or evening, depending on your timelines. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rob.
Quite welcome.